Of the two detectives Jonathan Green interviewed extensively for this book, Pete Forcelli and John O'Malley, I'm profiling O'Malley, not just because he's from Soundview. He's a well-reputed and well-known investigator who started off as a homicide detective in the New York Police Department's Bronx Division, and then distinguished himself working as an investigator with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. There, his job entailed gaining the trust of gang members to flip them, turn them into informants, state witnesses, and cooperators, thereby enabling the federal prosecutors to build an ironclad case against other members of the gang. Working with the feds, he solved 400-plus homicides. He retired in 2015. The big takeaway from the book is the cops' tough and thankless job in the gang-infested streets and localities where black kids kill other black kids. There's one particular instance quoted in the book that stands out. It's on page 62. Quote, "It was frustrating and thankless work. Distrust between the police and the Bronx communities had broken down into outright animus. 2 years earlier, in 1986, a Bronx drug dealer named Larry Davies, wanted for 7 murders, shot 6 of O'Malley's colleagues from Bronx homicide as they tried to arrest him at an apartment on Fulton Avenue. He escaped. O'Malley joined the manhunt, but after Davies was captured, he was found not guilty of killing the drug dealers by a Bronx jury. Then, in a second trial, a jury acquitted him of the attempted murder of the police officers because he had acted in self-defense. Bronx jury came to mean an impossible conviction." Unquote. And on page 165, Pete Forcelli, as a 20-year-old white rookie cop, recalls what life was like as a patrolman in Soundview. Quote, "Out on patrol, the single cop killer from Body Count, led by the rapper Ice-T, or NWA's F*** the Police, seeped out of the open windows of the projects and drifted from powerful stereos in cars like the Suzuki Samurai that Forcelli often saw in Edenwald. A couple of years earlier, Forcelli had answered an urgent call in Eastchester Heights, where he found Hector Fontanes, a 26-year-old police officer, dying as he was lifted up by other cops, his bulletproof vest torn to ribbons and dripping with blood. He had been shot in the back and stomach by a 21-year-old with a .357 Magnum. Sometimes kids would shout out the lyrics of Cop Killer at Forcelli from across the street. If he ignored them, it got worse the next time he passed. So invariably he confronted them and let them know he was watching them." Unquote. In part 1 of this series, I quoted statistics on black boys and men killed by police as well as on general nature of gun violence in black communities. I am adding O'Malley's views on the subject here. Quote, "Fox News was broadcasting a wave of protests aimed at police treatment of African Americans. In some ways, O'Malley felt relief that his father-in-law wasn't around to witness the backlash and eventual murders of policemen after the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. In the course of his career, O'Malley had seen 800 to 1,000 dead bodies, all beyond the glare of TV cameras or social activists who had never been inside a New York City housing project controlled by a gang. He wished that people could walk in his shoes for one day, make an arrest of a violent felon like Justice, explain to grieving mothers in the projects about their slaughtered loved ones, all the while being treated with a scorn as they attempted to find the killer." Unquote. So it is also important to acknowledge these feelings by people serving on the front lines, probably as important as talking about systemic racism in law enforcement and justice system. And it's not like police was much of a deterrence in places like the famous nightclub Palladium, where one evening Notorious B.I.G. was playing and Pistol Pete Rollock attended with Pipe and David Twin Mullins, despite a heavy police presence and several undercover agents. And Pete wanted Arthur Frisky Johnson, an older dealer from Soundview, dead. just over a rumor that Frisky held a grudge against Pete and would kill him or buy a shooter from the projects to kill him. And David Twin Mullins shot Frisky in the head in the club as Notorious B.I.G. played and police were assembled outside. I'm sure cops felt that they were putting themselves on the line for a community that hated them and hated each other. However, the difference officers like O'Malley have made is plain to see. It's in fact awe-inspiring. He gets letters on every Christmas, Thanksgiving, even on Father's Day from former drug gang members who said goodbye to their criminal careers when they became informants and cooperators against fellow drug dealers and murderers. One of them wrote to him, "You saved my life." One of those calls is always from Pipe, which brings me to something that O'Malley said to Pipe that I personally did not like and found offensive. But for that, we'll have to go back, way back, to how O'Malley was raised and the place that he called home. Even though John O'Malley's father was a clerk for a famous insurance company, the family was full of law enforcement officials. 3 of O'Malley's uncles were detectives, 2 of his cousins were patrolmen, his father-in-law was a cop, and O'Malley always wanted to be a police officer too. He grew up in a middle-class household in Clason Point, an area near the Soundview housing projects, not far from the corner of Randall and Rosedale Avenues, later known as Cozy Corner, that became the place of business for SMM. O'Malley's grandmother had lived in Clason Point Gardens, a neighborhood behind Soundview houses. Clason Point Gardens were a row of 2-story houses with garden in front, as compared to the 7-story towers with apartments of Soundview houses. Both were low-income housing projects, but Clason Point Gardens was rarely in trouble. It was a safe place compared to Soundview houses, which is how Green describes his 2-bedroom cottage residence at Clason Point. His father planted an oak tree outside their bungalow when O'Malley was 10 years old. His parents were married for life, and he went to school, just like his sisters. The only disruption in their idyllic lives was when some bullies set one of his sister's hair on fire on a school bus, and immediately his father took it upon himself to drop them off to school himself, under his protection. At 14, O'Malley worked part-time like most kids do in the summer at a famous beach club, Shorehaven Beach Club, which was a walking distance away from his house. At 17, O'Malley bought a few Christmas trees with his friends to sell outside the church. He continued his studies in the middle-class urban setting his well-settled parents and extended family had given him. He graduated from an expensive school. He applied to join the police. When there were signs that the entire Bronx neighborhood was going to go to hell with the arrival of heroin, his family shifted to New Hampshire to live in a $400,000 house. O'Malley stayed in the Bronx because he had a well-paying job in a company that manufactured elevators. He also stayed because he was waiting for his police exam result. There was no domestic violence, drug habit, unemployment, or troubled teenage years in his household. Both of his parents were in his life, just like they were present in their daughters' lives. He was not hunted, nor did he hunt other boys. There was no gun violence on his street, no brothers who took care of him when in trouble. No pebble beach on top of a building at Randall Avenue where he took girls for sex. Girls did not throw themselves at him for money or drugs. His mother did not ask a 19-year-old to take away his virginity. He did not have an absent father or a father who just drove up to give him Rolexes during his stints in and out of prison. And I doubt he had drugs in his life, or else he would have mentioned it while talking to Green. In fact, he met his wife Annie at an inn that served family dinners, a homely, respectable place. Her father was a legendary Bronx detective. She was studying to be a nurse. After marriage, Mr. O'Malley and Mrs. O'Malley shifted into an apartment at Throgs Neck, a peaceful working-class neighborhood area, and later on into a house bought for $71,000 in an upper-middle-class area with a garden in front. Mob bosses lived in that area, but as Green notes, those same mob bosses ensured that nothing bad happened where they lived. O'Malleys were able to afford such a good place only because of the goodwill and finances that his mother-in-law was able to provide. She gave them $17,700 so that they could make the down payment for the $71,000 house. O'Malleys were able to pay her back that amount within a year. This did not mean that they stopped moving. No, in order to give their children a better future in schooling, O'Malley and his wife shifted completely out of the deteriorating Bronx. Their next stop was upstate New York. By 1988, the year his paths first crossed with members of the teenage drug dealers later known as members of Sex Money Murder, O'Malley had been part of NYPD for more than a decade and was working as a detective for the Bronx Homicide Task Force. Why am I giving this biodata? What I am trying to say is that he had nothing in common with Pipe or Sugar or even Pistol Pete Rollock. So when one fine day in 2000, when Pipe the informant is driven around Soundview in a neat black Federal car by O'Malley, a ride given in crisp detail on pages 318 to 320, O'Malley shows him where he grew up, where he studied, where he sold the Christmas trees as a teenager, and where his father planted the damn oak tree in the 1950s, now a humongous assortment, and where he had lived all those years ago. All this seemed tone-deaf to me. Even Pipe says as much. Quote, "This is white boy territory," unquote. And his one attempt at being relatable to a black dude from a gang in the projects fell flat when he said, "Wow, did you see that Tiger Woods the other day? He killed it at the Open." And Pipe retorts, "Joe, do I look like the type of to you that watches Tiger Woods?" I mean, for Pipe, O'Malley could have been an alien from outer space. What's more, O'Malley was a decade or so older than these kids. He had grown up at Clason Point, not Soundview housing project, and had seen good stable times in a peaceful neighborhood, and once everything turned to shit, had long moved away from the area. He had nothing in common with the black boy who dreamt of being Dr. Huxtable from The Cosby Show while working at the Medfoods supermarket as a bagger, and who was cooking food for his 6 younger siblings in a shabby apartment with frequent trips to foster care. A boy who had a drug-addicted mother who stole stuff from stores to pay bills and used her son to do it. A mother who blew her welfare checks on her drug habit, with the 7 children going hungry. A boy whose father was a deadbeat dad, a career criminal who was in and out of jail all the time, with a drug habit of his own. A boy whose relatives were poor and criminal. There was no educational structure or authority figure in Pipe's life other than the 14-year-old Pete Rollock, who by contrast was a well-to-do privately schooled son of a famous gangster, kind of like a small-town rock star, and who gave Pipe a sense of belonging, brotherhood, sense of purpose. Plus, he could make a quick buck with little effort. Also, it was Pete who stood up for Pipe when no one else did. Of course, it's also true that Pete would have killed Pipe for some perceived disrespect. 14-year-old Pete wanted an 11-year-old Pipe to join his petty drugs delivery business. And when Pipe joined the group to stand at Cozy Corner to sell crack stones, his mother didn't even bat an eye. As a teenager, O'Malley went to Ferry Inn to pick up a soda. By contrast, Pipe and Sugar went to a store to pick up their guns hidden in the freezer or with the drinks. No one came to rescue Pipe from the streets. No one shifted his family out of Soundview when shit hit the fan. In fact, it was Pipe himself who had moved his sisters out of Soundview to keep them safe from retaliation, and he did so with the money he made by selling drugs and doing Pete's bidding. By the age of 24, Pipe was facing a life sentence. It's nothing short of a miracle that he made a semblance of a normal, ordinary life without any help and is still alive. And since I believe Sean Sugar was pretty much institutionalized in the system he grew up in, having seen no other life, that's why he gravitated towards what he knew. So O'Malley had no business talking down to Pipe, at least that's how he comes across during this exchange. But like I said before, his life and work have made a difference for the better. He is a legend because he delivered results for law enforcement as well as the well-being of the black neighborhoods. Jonathan Green mentions on page 385, quote, "Both Pete Forcelli and John O'Malley have gone on to provide crucial evidence and testimony in freeing the wrongfully convicted, including 5 people from Soundview who were sentenced to 25 years to life for the murder of a cab driver in September 1997. One of them, Eric Glisson, wrote to the Southern District asking for help. His letter was passed on to O'Malley in June 2012. O'Malley and Forcelli knew it was sex money murder who had carried out the killing. 2 members had admitted shooting a cab driver in Soundview, although at the time, no victim had been recorded at the 43rd Precinct. O'Malley and Forcelli got the Bronx DA to reopen the case, and 18 years after they first went to prison, Eric Glisson and the 4 others were released." This particular case of wrongfully convicted and another one that O'Malley was involved in is mentioned in detail in Don Slepian's 2024 audiobook, The Sing Sing Files, detailing the long, arduous path to justice for the wrongfully convicted. Don Slepian is a Dateline producer, and his book has just been turned into an MSNBC 4-hour documentary series. So John O'Malley's good work was instrumental in not only getting drug gangs off the streets and putting people behind bars, but also for getting the wrongfully convicted out of prison. His good work lives on.